marker does not just impress upon a species the brutality necessary to culminate its desired end, but also had the horrific habit of unleashing what was already there within a species to begin with. Yes, while it did turn some into literal monsters that hack and slash their way through droves of people like a hot knife through butter, some will retain their human characteristics for much longer than their peers, resulting in some pretty horrific outcomes for others involved. You see, humans in this case are naturally quite violent. It's sort of our thing. According to the theory of evolution, even our ancestors were quite aggressive with one another, with ironically the term serial killer being created, I believe, in just the 1890s due to a man named H.H. Holmes. However, the ironic part is this goes way back further than that, to when humans were much hairier. A cave was discovered where at one point in time an ape would appear to probably have been related to human lineage in some capacity, was collecting skulls of other apes. Known as the violent ape theory, it's important to remember that in Dead Space, it works on the exact same timeline that we are on now. As the marker hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, mammals would take the lead, being intrinsically altered by the marker and the signal that it produces. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it was a 1 part natural, 9 parts altered sort of deal, which resulted in some being resistant or outright immune to the marker signal, while others would become aggressive monsters. But therein lies the subject matter for today. As the signal blasted through the colony of Aegis VII, it would activate the baser instincts of the animal known as man, which had essentially been ingrained in the very DNA of our species. Of course, we all know it, it's fear. This fear would be catapulted into the stratosphere by visual hallucinations and the attack of symbols, as an unknown language was constantly being run through the mind of people that were there when the signal washed over them, which would induce a form of dementia in a very specific part of the brain that would have far-reaching implications. All of this would result in 2 men meeting, Dr. Mercer and a man who had a psychotic breakdown on Aegis VII, Brant Harris. Together, these 2 men would create something much, much worse than what the marker had seemed to be producing naturally. So in today's episode, let's discuss the abomination known as the Hunter from Dead Space Remake. So I believe we should start this video from the most logical beginning. Who is the Hunter and how did he become what he was? Because clearly there is something different about the creation of this creature. Brant Harris was a miner down on Aegis VII when they cracked into the planet to extract its resources. Upon doing so, he, like many others who had found this thing under the ground, were immediately besieged by a wave of energy. Initially presenting as ringing in the ears as symptoms, this would progress into insomnia. As the sleep deprivation got worse, eventually the miners, including Brant, report to the medical personnel seeking some sort of relief for the nightmares and sleeplessness. This is when Brant would finally crack. See, the thing about sleep deprivation is it causes your brain to act more and more erratically. Even just 24 hours without sleep can decrease your ability to concentrate and make rational decisions. Turn that into 2 weeks and you will literally meet your end due to lack of sleep. After going after the doctor, eventually his hallucinations set in, which was quite common with sleep deprivation to begin with, but even more common with the marker. As the medications would not help him, he would become increasingly aggressive, where he would attack the doctor, blaming him for his suffering he was currently experiencing. In a struggle, he took the doctor hostage, named Solero, as PSEC officers came to break it up and arrest him. Fortunately, a nurse was nearby, and she would take a plasma cutter to the abdominal section, which sliced her in half. At this point, Brant was arrested and sent up to the USG Ishimura, where he would not escape and was held in containment to be tried at a later date for what he did once whatever was happening on Aegis VII had been got control. Of course, we all know this would not happen. After being transported to the Ishimura, a unitologist by the name of Dr Mercer would immediately take notice of him. Prior to the marker being brought on board, people would watch in horror as to what was taking place on the planet. Of course, the freaking captain was a unitologist, so immediate priority, despite seeing with his special eyes what was taking place on the planet, was to now bring this thing on board that somehow was found just prior to the outbreak happening, and I'm sure that's not connected at all. Don't worry about it. Before this happened, though, Mercer would make contact with Brant after he was put under the watch of the doctors, such as Chief Psych Officer Dr. Warwick. It was noted that Brant could not sleep without chemical aid, and while he was there, he kept screaming about how the nurse wasn't the nurse, as he began to scrawl an unknown language and symbols all over any surface he could, saying his dreams needed to speak. This is what initially piqued the interest of Mercer. Mercer then would begin entering a conflict with Dr. Nicole Brennan, or Isaac's girlfriend, around this time, who believed unitology was a cult, as Mercer wanted to study Brant under different methods, saying his delusions were religiously significant. And considering again the captain was a unitologist, there was really no pushback on Mercer from the higher-ups. As Mercer would listen to Brant talk, he realized that he needed to do something in order to make humanity whole. So let me ask you something. You're a psychologist, you're just sitting there hanging out. A planet is basically on a murderous rampage and everybody there is tearing each other apart like Christmas presents. You hear the phrase, they're hungry, they're coming, they'll make us whole. Would you sit there and think, oh yeah, that sounds great for humanity? Well, probably not, but that was Dr. Mercer's thinking. Anyhow, it was from here the experimentations would begin on Brant in order to make him essentially capable of absorbing the marker and starting a convergence event, which we all know results in the moons. Shown in a holographic replays, tissue from a necromorph would be placed behind the right eye into the brain. This tissue, unlike infection by the signal or the bacteria itself, like with the infectors, would more slowly take over the host, as the tissue sample would need to spread via mitosis or potentially contact infection, where neuron by neuron they would slowly be altered until the entire brain was taken over. But what would this look like concerning symptoms and the actual physical process? Let's discuss that for a moment. Once the necromorph tissue was delicately implanted into the brain of the person, it should be noted that Mercer had two methods. The first was to just straight up stab somebody in the frontal lobe with a piece of tissue on the eye of a pike. This version would result in the immediate end of the person by brain hemorrhage and likely either turn them into the corruption or just your standard slasher, seeing as the tissue would have to be reanimated and it would not be like corrupting actual tissue. However, Brant was different. As this tissue was implanted into his brain exceedingly precisely and in much the same way that EarthGov would extract the marker plans from Isaac's brain through his eye, this would indicate that the marker signal is stored in the frontal lobe, specifically the inferior frontal gyrus or the bottom of the frontal lobe. This area of the brain is quite critical for daily operation as it affects attention, motor inhibition, and imagery, as well as many social cognitive processes and speech functions, all of which are heavily affected by the marker signal. Disruption of this area of the brain by the marker signal is typically what we see, which leads to people to become aggressive and hallucinate before turning on one another. But with a tissue sample there, this would have a much more profound effect on the human form to gate the hunter than typically what we would see otherwise. With this tissue placed there, it's clear Brant would begin to develop slowly at first. While he was very much so driven insane by the marker signal, Mercer seems to have some control over him. He would talk to Brant about what he was seeing, as Brant would describe the marker's plan, which somehow was not a complete red flag for Mercer. Mercer would lament over the fact that his brain was not capable of understanding the marker signals, but his brain was resistant less. So you may question as to why this is the case. We know Papa Roanoke has got the crackpot theories for you. Something to understand about the human brain and physics in general is folding causes there to be more physical space in the same amount of area. This can be easily expressed and visualized by understanding Einstein's brain. Typical humans in the prefrontal cortex have 3 gyri, which are 3 folds total. This will yield the average amount of intelligence. Einstein's brain actually had a 4th folded gyri in the region linked to abstract thought and special visualization. This extra fold put him well beyond what most people were able to or even possibly could comprehend. This may be what we see with more intelligent people who are able to resist the signal. Possessing a hypothesized extra gyri, their brains are able to deal with the signal changing the areas as there is more tissue present. However, being resistant doesn't mean immune, so even intelligent people will fall to the madness soon enough, sort of like Isaac if he was to stay in that long enough. Even though Mercer was able to keep his human form for much longer, to say that his experiments did not require at least some intervention by the signal inducing insanity would be a stretch. Because if you've seen his experiments, they're pretty messed up. But then again, humans on this planet have done messed up things that didn't even require a marker signal, so who really knows? But it's important to remember that the signal also causes dementia. This degradation of tissue within the brain means the more you have, the longer you get to stay on Team Human. However, this is just the signal and how it affects you. Introducing the tissue directly into the brain, creating a monster, would have to affect the brain in an entirely different way. But before moving on to that discussion of neurology of the hunter, we must first talk about the physical changes, as while the hunter does appear to at least be similar somewhat to the standard slasher variant, there are some absolutely horribly awesome changes to the body that will make sense here in a moment when we cover the mitosis of the limb regeneration. Now, starting with the feet, we see this creature needs to clip its claws. Well, I guess it's a creature. It's still technically human, just severely altered. The big toe has claws several inches in length, while the pinky toe also possesses a claw of its own, but much smaller. The leg is still in its plantigrade structuring with all the usual features. However, as we move up to the shin area, we begin to see something interesting. The skin appears thin and the muscle is increased considerably under that skin. It's also entirely possible there is no skin left, but we do see extra bone growth sporadically scattered throughout the area, suggesting an almost cancerous-like growth. When the hunter walks, there is much more weight on its knees that will make it pretty much stay bent unless it chooses to completely stand upright, typically seen as an intimidation factor. It is also said, unlike other slashers who do not hate, they're just compelled to attack, the hunter, upon non-successfully attacking Isaac, will see this as an insult, suggesting cognitive functions are still somewhat present in the hunter, allowing for it to have a very much so human mental trait. Moving up the leg, we see the muscle overall in the quadriceps region has been increased, and more bone can be seen sticking out of the pelvic connection points, as well as just sporadically along the femur. The abdominals are not well defined, and if we take a look, we can actually see Brant's original arms are fused within his body, having this tissue cover up the arms, much like a straitjacket that has been basically applied to his body. And if you kind of use the really cool function, which is blast away all of his skin, you can even see the arm bones of him wrapped in said abdomen. All on the abdomen and chest, there can be more bone growth seen, which is pretty much the standard. Moving around to the back of the creature, we can see that his spinal column is elongated and is also sticking out as it has breached, at least the skin, if there is any skin, although it really just kind of looks like muscle, to be honest. Heading to the shoulders, they have grown very similar appendages to some of the various slashers seen, in which the arms are completely disregarded and new ones are grown utilizing the shoulder blades as scythes, which is kind of interesting because if you disrupt the path for a slasher, it will actually just retreat back to a vent and try to find another way around, whereas if you disrupt the pathway to a hunter, it will stare at you and sharpen its blades using the other blade to do so. Malicious intent. The hunter's actually a turbo douche, it seems. Moving up to the head of this creature, we see the mandible has completely given away and instead it has been replaced by 4 long tendrils that hang down and are now movable when the creature yells at you. The face has lost any resemblance to Brant, and the only thing that shows it was once human is the skull. There's no hair on its head anymore, and the eyes are beady and release a small amount of light, indicating that the bacteria is present throughout all the other infected forms is also present in him. The hunter has grown considerably since the infection of Brant Harris, now being a full head and shoulders taller than Isaac. Isaac is said to be around 5'11" canonically, which means that's probably about 7'5" to around 8 feet tall for the hunter's height, or in heathen units, that's 226.06 to 243.84 centimeters tall. And he's not even a lanklet. What a Chad. The neurology behind the hunter is just as complex as its limb regeneration, as these are going to be linked to one another. Upon the tissue being implanted into Brant's brain, it would go neuron by neuron, corrupting them all. However, this would not have the standard impact of a body being kind of changed by signal or the bacteria. When a neuron dies due to oxygen deprivation or in general dementia, what happens is when a neuron meets its end, the dendrites and axon will actually curl back up around the cell body, and this will sever the connection between the cells, overall reducing communication. If enough of these neurons do this, it will have a noticeable effect on the functionality of the brain of the person, resulting in aggression, agitation, irritability, depression, forgetfulness, and lack of concentration. It could be easily surmised that when a person is dropped and their brains begin dying, that all of these connections are severed even when the cells are reanimated. Because of this, conscious thought is lost as all cells are damaged even if they are being run by the marker signal. So basically, the marker signal may not really inspire new neuronal connections. With Brant, it was different. As the necro tissue was corrupting living tissue, these connections amongst the neurons were not lost. As the frontal lobe began to be converted into Team Necromorph, this would result in aggression, but a direct ability from Mercer due to his human side. In fact, at one point, Mercer would actually send Brant to go collect osmium from the miners area on the Ishimura, where he would push one of the men who tried to stop him into a suit kiosk where he was crushed by the machinery within. He was able to overpower the man quite easily, indicating that his neurons working in conjunction with his muscularity, even if not greatly increased, was still having an effect on him. So what is happening? As more of his living neurons were corrupted, the branch point is the inferior gyrus. This would first and foremost be affected as this area was already hit by the dementia due to the signal to begin with. As it began spreading, it would hit a less demented tissue where motor inhibition was located. This would cause him to be able to override his brain's natural control mechanisms of strength reduction. With this, he could easily overpower anyone at this point and did show some concern when it came to Mercer when he changed. A few days would have passed after implementation and his ability to speak was beginning to go out the window, indicating that his Broca's area may have been struggling to maintain its non-infected, at least functionality at this point, as he was also remarking that he was awake and dead but made whole. He then asked what happens if he goes after Mercer, which Mercer remarked that he will be able to contain him. Either way, it's clear at this point that while Brant was still in there, he was heavily influenced by the necromorph tissue, altering his brain to the point of accepting that he had become a violent monster. Eventually, however, the transformation would be complete with Mercer telling him it was time for a real hunt as he fully gave in to his mutations. From here, he would then run across the Giga Chad known as Isaac Clarke, who, much like a parent trapped in a party at Chuck E. Cheese, he really just wanted to get out of this pizza rat youngling casino. Mercer became aware of Isaac quite early, trapping him with the hunter as Mercer had not been able to kickstart convergence yet, so he elected to add in just dismembering limbs for funsies. He literally was like, well, that could be an interesting idea. We haven't tried dismembering. Like, okay, man, I guess. Why not? Sure, send it. So as Isaac attacked the hunter, it became clear that this creature was well beyond any form of necromorph. Not only was it more powerful and quicker than other necromorphs, but it was also able to regenerate lost limbs, including its head, something that would incapacitate any other form. How could this be possible? Well, I believe it all goes back to the nervous system and its infection point. Again, neuronal tissue is exceedingly delicate. When it expires, those dendrites and axons will wrap back up on themselves and cease communication as the cell is no talking to the one next to it. This will lead to the aforementioned breaks all over the brain, which will have profound effects later when the person is possibly reanimated. One of these issues seems to be that the nervous system is no longer able to move the limbs of the necromorph when it has been severed, as mitosis seems to be affected, which in turn renders them useless and unable to move. The necromorph is not dead, just immobile. The hunter is completely different. Having living tissue corrupted seems to have sent its mitotic abilities into overdrive, but not only that, it can regenerate its nervous system as well. This is a key difference in what makes this creature much more of a threat. Upon severing one of its limbs, it will start simultaneously in the muscle, bone, and nervous system. As this area grows, a surge of blood will enter the wound, causing it to rapidly grow forth with the limb reforming to its original version. And even when you attack the central nervous system and remove the brain, this will all grow back as well. This would seem to imply that the plans for the build are housed within the necromorph tissue, and there may still be some human tissue left in its unaltered form that retains its ability to undergo mitosis, which is then used to grow this new limb. Because remember, it appears as though in reanimated tissue, mitotic abilities are largely lost. Keeping unaltered human tissue would also seem to be supported by the fact that Brant can still take an attack personally. Brother moons do not care what ants under them do, considering that they've just pretty much assimilated countless species. However, an ant to an ant may be an affront, with the hunter becoming angered by this fight. So what happens if it becomes angry enough? Well, you can do what I do and just smack it around with a plasma cutter long enough, but if the hunter doesn't just, end Isaac in a typical way by accidentally smashing his head off, it feels much more personal. Rearing back its scythes, it will ram these into the torso of Isaac, completely severing his armor that he's wearing. The bones of his ribcage are also destroyed, and any internal organs in the way, likely his lungs, are then just basically turned into mincemeat, as the severing of the pulmonary veins and arteries, possibly even the aorta of the heart, is going to be pretty much confirmed. As he lifts him up, he will jam the scythes in 2 more times, hitting anything else that he hasn't already sliced, before cutting off Isaac's legs and arm. Isaac will then reach up with his other arm as he's freed from that agony by having his head sliced off before being cut in half. And again, seems a little personal to me. That said, Isaac doesn't meet his ends on my run, except for what you just watched. Anyhow, there is no way to take the hunter out under traditional means, given its ability to repair its meat suit via the mitosis. As the hunter keeps hunting you, which is a very human trait ingrained into Brant's mind, from the results of humans being pack hunters, it will chase him into the ship room. Upon Isaac cutting its limbs off and freezing it in place, he's able to test fire the engines, ensuring that there is no human cell left to undergo mitosis to heal this creature, completely cooking him all the way through and destroying the threat. Brant was a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong times several different times. From the marker signal unleashing dementia and hallucinations on him, to Mercer finding him and implanting him with a necromorph tissue, to the tail end of the ship blasting him with several thousand-degree engine exhaust. The fact that he was a fusion of necromorph and human tissue would render him as something more than both, though it is entirely likely this was a temporary arrangement based on timing. It's likely that as more time passed, his unaffected cells would continue to degrade by direction of the signal of the marker or by necromorph tissue, continuing to take over his body. But one final point that I wanted to talk about is how would the necromorph tissue even inspire unaffected cells to undergo the mitosis in the first place? It's important to understand that the infection the necromorphs present is not just a physical infection, but a genetic one as well. The bacteria that is currently lighting up the eyes of the hunter is known as a form of viral bacteria. Now, there's going to be some weirdo in the comments like, actually, a virus is in a bacteria. Yeah, insert the nerd emoji here. Like, I know, I get it. Trust me. When I say viral bacteria, I mean it's a bacteria that has viral properties. In fact, I did an entire video over the viral bacteria in Dead Space, if you want to check that out. But the bacteria itself is known to infect other cells by entering them and altering the behavior. Remember, this is a completely alien bacteria than what we are used to with Earth. Its properties of how it performs are completely different. When this bacteria alters the DNA of a living cell, it may be that it affects specifically the promoters of the mitotic genes, such as, and get your notes ready, cyclin A, cyclin B, and cyclin B2, amongst like 8 other genes. But it may be that when this bacteria detects damage to the body, or the necromorph tissue detects damage, it will rapidly induce this mitosis amongst the living cells to regrow those limbs by specifically targeting those areas of the DNA and then gene expression. Point is, living tissue is heavily affected in this operation, whereas non-living tissue that has been reanimated seems to be controllable, but has been, or if it has been severely damaged to the point that mitosis has been lost, then it's not able to repair the body. But with that said, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoy, then leaving a like is awesome, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. And I do like 2 videos a week, and I don't know if I sound tired or not. I just got done with a 3-day drive from Atlanta, Georgia to Seattle, Washington, where I'm currently at PAX West, and I'm pretty sure I have to do another video after this to keep up with those 2 videos a week. It doesn't matter though, you don't care about that. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description. And speaking of that, I'd like to thank my patrons real quick. First, I'd like to thank our astronaut, Rosie Kinks. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our 2 astrophysicists, Death's Dancer and Zach Smith, as well as our scientists, Argent Sentinel, Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of B-grade horror movies, Logan Satome, Robbie Cruz, and Tyson Okanishi. For the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping this channel running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. Hope everyone enjoyed. I'll see y'all next time.